Virgo, there are things you know about yourself that you can't trace back to a single moment. They were never taught directly, never explained. They arrived in the texture of what was normal and what was never questioned, never named, never offered as something that could be different. And somewhere in the growing up, you absorbed them as truth, as just how things are, as you, if you've ever felt the weight of something that doesn't quite feel like yours, this might be the closest anyone has come to saying what it actually is. There were women before you. You know some of their names, some of their faces, some of their stories, the version that got told, the one considered safe enough to pass down. And then there were the other stories, the ones that didn't get told, the ones that lived in the silences at certain tables, in the way certain subjects changed the quality of the air in a room, in the look that passed between people when something got too close to the real thing and had to be steered away from before it could be named. Those untold stories didn't disappear. They don't. Stories that aren't told don't vanish. They go underground. They become patterns, behaviors, the specific shape of how a family moves through the world without knowing why it moves that way. The things that are simply done because that's how things are done. The ways of being that nobody chose consciously, but that got passed down anyway through observation, through what was modeled, through the slow, invisible education of growing up inside a particular way of seeing. And you absorbed it. Of course you did. You were a child in a world that was already shaped before you arrived. You didn't get to evaluate the patterns before you internalized them. You didn't get to decide which ones fit you and which ones belong to a different person in a different time facing different circumstances. You just took them in. The way children take everything in without filters, without the perspective that only comes much later, without knowing that some of what felt like truth was actually someone else's survival strategy passed down as fact. So let's look at what might have been passed down. Not in your specific family. I don't know your specific family. But in the particular recognizable patterns that tend to travel through generations of women in ways that feel like character but are actually inheritance. The silence first. The specific practiced silence around certain things, the ability to feel something significant, something that deserved to be spoken, addressed, named, and say nothing, to absorb it, to process it internally, and continue to be the person who handles it without showing that there's anything to handle. That silence was probably called strength at some point in your lineage, probably praised, probably held up as the right way to be: composed, undemanding, capable of carrying without complaint. And you learned it. You watched it being done, and you learned it was how things were supposed to go. That having needs you expressed openly was somehow less admirable than having needs you managed quietly. That showing the weight of what you carry was a kind of weakness. That the stronger thing, the more respectable thing, was to keep moving, keep functioning, keep being the person who holds things together without ever letting the holding show. And maybe that served you in certain moments. Maybe that capacity to absorb and continue to carry without breaking got you through things that needed getting through. But there's a question worth asking slowly about where that silence has also been operating in your life in ways that haven't served you, in the relationships where you felt things you didn't say, in the moments where something needed to be addressed and you smoothed it over instead, in the times you accepted less than you needed because asking for more felt like being too much, because the silence that was a survival strategy for the women before you who may have lived in circumstances where speaking certain things had real significant consequences. That silence inherited by you in a different context, in a different life, with different options available becomes something else. It becomes the thing that keeps you from being fully known, from having your actual needs met, from taking up the space that is genuinely, rightfully yours. Uh, and then there's what got called love, the specific version of love that was modeled probably not in words, but in action, in what was normal in your lineage. Because love, in many generations of women, looked like service, like sacrifice, like the compression of self in service of others, like putting everyone else's needs in the center and finding whatever was left for yourself, like measuring your worth by how well you cared for the people around you rather than by who you were independent of that caring. And that version of love, genuinely, it came from real love, from women who cared deeply and expressed it through what they had available to them, through their time, their labor, their constant presence, their willingness to give whatever was asked. That was real, that was meaningful, and it deserves to be honored for what it was. But it also had a cost, a specific, recurring, rarely examined cost. The self that got compressed in the constant service, the wants that got quiet because there was never quite the right moment to voice them, the dreams that got practical because the impractical ones didn't fit the shape of the life, the identity that became so thoroughly organized around caring for others that the question, who am I when I'm not taking care of someone, became genuinely difficult to answer. And you may have inherited that, not the circumstances. Your circumstances may be entirely different, but the orientation, the reflexive putting of others first, the discomfort with your own needs, the specific guilt that arrives when you do something purely for yourself without it being in service of someone else, the feeling quiet, persistent, that your worth is measured in what you provide rather than in simply who you are. That's inherited. That's not originally yours. That's a pattern that made sense in a particular context for a particular woman in a particular set of circumstances, and then got passed down as just how love works, as just how women are, as just the right way to be in the world. And here's the thing about what they couldn't do that you can. There are choices you have that the women before you didn't, real choices, structural ones, the ability to leave situations that weren't working, to build financial independence, to say no to things that were asked of them as though they were simply owed, to take up space, physical, professional, relational, without apologizing for the taking, to be ambitious without it being considered a failure of femininity, to want things for themselves without it being considered selfishness. Those choices weren't available in the same way. In many cases, they weren't available at all. And so the women before you didn't make them, not because they didn't want to, but because the cost of making them social, financial, relational was too high, because the world they lived in had decided what they were allowed, and they navigated within that allowed with whatever grace and strength and quiet endurance they could find. And in some part of you, in a place that doesn't fully operate in conscious thought, you may still be living as though those constraints apply to you, as though the permission they didn't have is also permission you don't have, as though making choices they couldn't make is somehow a betrayal of them, a stepping away from something you owe them, an ingratitude for everything they endured to give you the life you have. But here's what's true about that, about the guilt of wanting more than they had, of living differently than they lived, of refusing what they accepted. They endured what they endured so that you wouldn't have to. That's the thing that gets lost in the guilt, the direction of it. They didn't carry what they carried so that you would carry it too. They carried it so that someone, maybe not them, maybe not their children, but someone down the line would get to put it down, would get to live in the space that the carrying created, would get to make the choices that the endurance made possible, would get to be fully, freely, without the specific constraints of a particular time and circumstance themselves. You are that someone, the one the carrying was for, and living fully, taking the space, making the choices, refusing the inherited compressions that no longer serve you, that isn't betrayal. That's the completion of something they started. That's the destination of everything they endured. And the patterns, the silence, the self compression, the love as service, the inherited smallness, those can stop here in you, not through violence toward them or toward the women who passed them down, but through the quiet, deliberate, ongoing choice to live differently, to speak what they couldn't, to take space they weren't given, to need openly what they needed in silence, to love in ways that include yourself rather than only at your own expense. That's the breaking of the cycle. Not dramatic, not a single moment. The daily choosing of something different, the noticing when the inherited pattern activates, and the decision to respond from your own life rather than from theirs, from your actual circumstances rather than theirs, from the full range of choices available to you now rather than the compressed range available to them then. You carry their love. That's real. That stays. The specific quality of care, of depth, of commitment that came through the line, and it's in you and it's genuinely yours. That doesn't need to be left behind. That's worth keeping, worth honoring, worth passing forward. But the limitations, the silence, the smallness, the compressed needs, the love that required self erasure, those were never meant to be permanent. They were responses to circumstances, and the circumstances changed. And you are living in the changed circumstances, and you are allowed, you have always been allowed to respond to your actual life rather than to theirs. Uh, so let the love come through. Let the depth come through. Let the care and the commitment and the specific warmth that traveled through all those women to reach you, let that come through fully. And let the rest. The silence that was never peace, the smallness that was never humility, the self erasure that was never strength, let that stop here in you now. Not as a rejection of them, as the fulfillment of everything they carried it for. You are what the endurance was building toward, a woman who gets to be fully herself, without apology, without compression, without the silence. Finally, without the silence.